Well, good evening. Welcome back to our Wednesday nights, and our sanctuary is pretty nice and warm. It's not toasty, I guess, but it's warmer than it is outside. And I appreciate coming. This is a little different from me. I'm used to doing almost always Bible studies, but this is a book that is very near and dear to me. I've read it several times. I've never really led a study of this book before, but I think we'll be profiting by kind of looking through it together. I'm not going to read it to us. I'm going to pick out passages here and there and kind of talk about how I hear them, and talk a little bit about C.S. Lewis himself. So welcome, and let me just start. Let me pray here at the beginning. Lord, we're grateful on this January evening for opportunity to come and hear from one of your faithful servants who has served your people so well with his intellect and his writing, especially this book. And we ask that you'd bless us as we read it again, discuss it, absorb it, think about it, and we ask you'd watch over us tonight. We pray in your name. Sure. Okay, so C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, a book I read in high school the first time. I think I read it again in college. I've read it, all of it and parts of it, a few other times. I know in high school the reason that I particularly enjoyed it because I was, you've heard me self-described as a nerd. I was a nerd, which meant, not only did I, love comic books, but I was a straight A student, and I was very much a head person, hopefully not heartless, but very much a head person, and very much interested in philosophy and rationalism and logic and all those things, and that certainly increased. And when you get to high school, when you've been in a youth group all your life, you start to really, at least some of us start to ask difficult questions about Christianity. How does this jibe with what you learn in other places? How does this jibe with what you know about reason and logic and history and science and all those things? And discovering C.S. Lewis and discovering especially this book, and then later discovering the Narnia books and his other books and all that, very helpful to me. And that's why when I've run across somebody who has real intellectual difficulties with Christianity, they have a hard time really grasping or believing or accepting some of the doctrines of Christianity, maybe because they have objections for something to them that doesn't make sense, doesn't jibe with some other part of their learning or their history or their education. I recommend this book. I've recommended it a lot for people because it's not just for people who are skeptical. It's for a lot of us who want to have a better ability to really explain our faith to somebody else who might be skeptical. We're starting confirmation this weekend, Friday and Saturday, with our 8th graders and other students haven't been through confirmation yet. And usually I teach 2 sessions. I usually have taught one session on church history, which is another topic that I enjoy a great deal, the history of Christianity. And I've usually taken 2 weeks to do that, one with sort of everything leading up to the Wesleyan or Methodist movement, and then I've usually spent another week kind of describing who we are as Methodists and the Wesley brothers and the Methodist movement and the history of Methodism in our country. But our youth directors this year asked if I could try to cover all of church history in one session, all the way through the Methodism, because they said they feel like our students need a second session in apologetics. And again, if you're familiar with that word, apologetics, our word apology comes from that, but apologetics is not about saying you're sorry. Apologia is a Greek word that means explanation. It means an explanation or even a defense of a way of thinking. And, Andrew and Emma really feel like a lot of our students, a lot of our high school and even middle school students face a world increasingly non-Christian, increasingly hostile to Christianity, and they want me to help them to be able to defend their beliefs, to be able to make a defense of Christianity. And so they asked that I would do one session on being able to do that, being able to defend the Christian faith, the Christian way of thinking, the Christian way of belief. And so I will do that here in a few weeks. But it's kind of fortunate that I've been rereading again Lewis's Mere Christianity, because that's a lot of what he does. When I first read it, I thought the title was odd, Mere Christianity, because again, the word mere, often when we use it, we kind of say merely as if it's kind of small or kind of, limited. When we say the word mere, it was a mere $2 to get in or something like that. But he uses the word, as words evolve and change, he's trying to say basic Christianity. And as we get into, if you've read sort of his intro, he says he's not trying to defend the Episcopal Church or the Church of England. He was an Episcopalian, or we would call him, an Anglican. He was part of the Church of England. But he says that's not what he's trying to do. My wife's watching online, and she says I'm out of frame. Let's see. Anybody pull it up real quick on your phone to see if I'm more in frame now. And then put it away. Don't watch me twice, but just see if I am more centered on the screen on the live stream. It's like 10 or 15 seconds behind. So, am I better off over here? Yeah. Yeah. Is this where I am now should be better? Okay. Well, that's what I get for wandering around. Okay. So thank you, Janine. I moved. I was like, why is somebody texting me? And why is my wife texting me in the middle of this? She knows what I'm doing. Anyway, mere would be basic. He is an Anglican, but he's not sharing the Anglican version of Christianity. He's trying to share Christianity that would be common to Catholics, Protestants, Anglicans, or Greek Orthodox, Christianity that is more the basics. I always avoid using the word the fundamentals because of the term fundamentalist. That word has become tainted, or, when we say the fundamentals, people think the fundamentalist, which means ultra-conservative, so you have to kind of stay away from that word. He's going to talk, if you've read ahead, about how what words we can and can't use, and words that have changed meaning or lost their meaning. Let me start by just giving a super brief biography of C.S. Lewis, because we want to know who we're hearing it from. C.S. Lewis, Clive Staples Lewis. You can see why he went by C.S. Actually, his friends called him Jack, which has nothing to do with Clive Staples. They had a family dog named Jackie, and somewhere when he was a preschooler, the parents started calling him Jack or Jackie, and that stuck. And so all of his family and friends called him Jack, which has nothing to do with Clive Staples. But he is Clive Staples Lewis. He was born in 1898. He died on November 22nd, 1963. Does that date familiar? November 22nd, 1963. Yes. He died within an hour of President Kennedy. He died the same day of the Kennedy assassination. So the news of his death was not really broadcast because he died the same day as Kennedy died. So people who might have otherwise gone, oh, C.S. Lewis died, that news was never really made it because of the Kennedy assassination. So he was not a professional professor of theology. He was not a professor of philosophy. He was a professor of literature, especially what we might call mythic literature. He taught for a long time at Oxford and then finished off his career at Cambridge, the two most prestigious universities in England, where he was a professor. He was an atheist. He was an atheist. He was raised in Ireland. He was raised as a Christian in the Church of Ireland. But at the age of 15, he decided that he was an atheist. He was mad at, he writes later, at the age of 15, he said he was very angry with God for not existing. And he was angry with other things in his life, and he decided at the age of 15 that he was an atheist. He was, of course, a very brilliant and bright young man. He was served in World War I. Do the math. Born in 1898. I think when he was 18, he was in World War I, in the trench warfare, in France, where he saw death all around him. It was after his time in World War I in the trenches that he came back to school and finished his education, continued as a very outspoken atheist, and eventually became a professor at Oxford of literature. There he met another celebrated author, J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, etc. And C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien became close friends and colleagues. They and a couple of other Oxford professors formed a little group called the Inklings, as in writing, ink, the Inklings, that gathered together regularly for conversation. They met at a pub there in Oxford, which I have been to. Not because it's a pub, but because when I went to England, it's been almost 10 years ago that I went with 3 other clergy to England to follow the life of Wesley, where John Wesley was also went to school at Oxford and became we would probably call a teaching assistant and then an assistant professor at Oxford. We made a point to go to the pub in Oxford where C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and their friends would gather weekly for their conversations. So there's a plaque at the booth where they used to sit at the pub in Oxford. J.R.R. Tolkien was a committed Christian, a committed Roman Catholic. If you've read The Hobbit, if you've read The Lord of the Rings, if you've watched the movies, the Christian influence is not as obvious as it is in Narnia. Narnia, it is much more blatant that Aslan is the Christ figure. Tolkien's writings have a Christian morality and understanding of the world, but they are not nearly as obviously Christian. But Tolkien himself was a devout Christian. And it is really through Tolkien's influence that C.S. Lewis began to reconsider Christianity. It was not an overnight conversion. It was not something that happened just, immediately. It happened over the course of several years. But here's how Lewis himself he talks about how he was brought into Christianity, quote, like a prodigal, kicking, struggling, resentful, darting his eyes in every direction for a chance to escape. That's how he felt about his conversion to Christianity, as someone who was dragged into Christianity looking for some way not to be a Christian. And he writes this about his conversion. He says, "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen College," which is part of Oxford, "night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of Him, capital H, approach of Him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England." So, that's how he saw his conversion. He felt intellectually he had no choice but to surrender to God. He became convinced of the truth of Christianity, and he became convinced of the truth of Christ. He didn't want to, but his mind forced him to surrender to God, forced him to come to Christ. Then, as I said, Tolkien continued to talk to him, continued to help him in this journey. Tolkien hoped that he would become Roman Catholic, but Lewis stayed Church of England, Anglican. So, as I said, he continued then to write. He continued as a professor at Oxford and then at Cambridge, and became, better and better and better known until there is at Westminster Abbey what they call a Poets' Corner, where the great British authors are celebrated, and there on the floor is C.S. Lewis's name there at Westminster Abbey. He's not buried at Westminster Abbey, but there is his name there at Poets' Corner, which also we got to see when we went there. So that's C.S. Lewis. So that's the man. So realize we're talking about a man who, much like Paul in some ways, was not a fan of Christ, was not a fan of Christianity until later in his life, when he had a serious turn towards God and towards Christianity. So, having said that, I know a few of you don't have maybe a different copy, but even though I have a couple of different copies of this, I'm using the same one that we had here, so that some of you, I'll mention the page number, and if you have a different version, it won't matter what page, but it'll be in general. You notice, if you look at the contents, after the preface and the foreword, there are really 4 major sections to this book. The first one on right and wrong, the second on what Christians believe, the third on Christian behavior, the fourth on really doctrine. And if you've read the first, I suggested if you wanted to read the first section up through book 1. Book 1 is probably the hardest one to get through. Because you keep waiting for him to talk about God or Christianity or Jesus or the Bible or something, and he doesn't do any of that until very, very at the end of that section. And we'll get there. But first I want to look at this preface of Lewis. And that's on page Roman numeral 7, VII, if you're looking in this copy. But of course he mentions that this book began as a series of radio addresses. He did not set out to write this as a book. He set out to write this as radio addresses, which he wrote these. He addressed England on the BBC during the bombing of London, right in the middle of London and England under siege from the Germans, daily bombing of England. It was during the middle of World War II that he was asked by the BBC to give addresses to the British people on what is Christianity. Now, I mean, that's almost unfathomable to think about that happening today. The BBC was the national broadcasting government-run radio during World War II, and they're fighting for their lives from the Nazis. They're being bombed, and they go to a professor at Oxford and say, "Would you give a series of talks on the radio explaining Christianity?" Which, is a remarkable thing, and it is the way that this book came to be. So, looking at the preface, he mentions that this was written not for the eye, but really for the ear. And I appreciate that because that was one of the first things I was taught in seminary. When you're writing a sermon, you don't write it like you write a term paper. You don't write it like an essay. You don't write it for the eye. You write it for the ear. So he wrote these for the ear, and he talks about how I left in the contractions. He said isn't, not is not, things like that. He points out on the next page, on page 8, Roman numeral, that how he is not attempting to lift up any particular denomination. How he is not a clergy person, and he's not trying to lift up any particular denomination. Because he's trying to stay in the very simplest, not simple is not a good word of Lewis, but the very core parts of Christianity. Look at the paragraph on page 9 that starts, "For example." Let's look at that paragraph. When he's talking about he's going to be silent on some issues. He says, "For example, such silence need not mean that I myself am sitting on the fence. Sometimes I am. There are questions at issue between Christians to which I do not think we have been told the answer. There are some to which I may never know the answer. If I asked them, even in a better world, I might, for all I know, be answered as a far greater questionnaire was answered. What is that to thee? Follow thou me. But there are other questions as to which I am definitely on one side of the fence, and yet say nothing. For I'm not writing to expound something that I would call my religion, but to expound mere Christianity, which is what it is and what it was long before I was born, and whether I like it or not." And he goes on to say, for example, he's not going to address that much about Mary. In other words, he's not going to address the Catholic view of Mary as opposed to the Protestant view of Mary. And he says, if he did, if he took the more Catholic view, a lot of Protestants would accuse him of idolatry toward Mary. And if he took the more Protestant view, the Catholics would be lost in his, dismissal of the Blessed Virgin. And so he says, I'm not going to, other than to say she was a virgin and she bore the Messiah, I'm not going to get into Mary. And then one of the other paragraphs I really like on page 10, Roman numeral X 10, the first full paragraph. Oddly enough, he says, "You cannot even conclude from my silence on disputed points either that I think them important or that I think them unimportant. For this is itself one of the disputed points." One of the things Christians are disagreed about is the importance of their disagreements. When two Christians of different denominations start arguing, it's usually not long before one asks whether such and such a point really matters, and the other replies, "Matter? Why, it's absolutely essential." And we know that's true. There are some things, when an earlier day, especially in the time of say, John Wesley, whether you believed in predestination or not, this was the lay it on the line, go to the ground, die over issue, predestination versus free will. Now, I think it's an important question. I'm a Wesleyan, which means I'm an Arminian, which means I believe in free will. But the difference between Calvinists, Presbyterians, and Methodists, who are Arminians, over this issue of free will was a matter that was incredibly important. John Wesley's good friend George Whitefield was a Presbyterian. He believed in predestination. And, of course, Wesley was an Arminian, as in the writings of Jacob Arminius, who opposed the writings of John Calvin, not to get too deep in the weeds. But they argued over this issue of predestination and free will. And Wesley said to his friend Whitefield, who was a Calvinist and therefore believed in predestination, he said, "Your God is my devil." In other words, a God who would predestine certain people to hell before they're even born. He said, that's awful. And yet, a Calvinist would say, no, the perfect will of God is from before time. And I'm not going to go there. I'm just saying that was the issue of the day. And he says, I'm not going to get into that. And even whether or not it's an issue worth arguing about. Which reminds me of a joke. I'm just going to pause. This is not Lewis. This is just a joke. But this is just to amplify what he's saying there about how some people think an issue is very important and others think it's of no importance. Once I saw a guy on a bridge about to jump. I said, "Don't do it." He said, "Nobody loves me." I said, "God loves you. Do you believe in God?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Are you a Christian or a Jew?" He said, "A Christian." I said, "Me too." "Protestant or Catholic?" He said, "Protestant." I said, "Me too." "What franchise?" He said, "Baptist." I said, "Me too." "Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist?" He said, "Northern Baptist." "Me too." "Northern Conservative Baptist or Northern Liberal Baptist?" He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist." I said, "Me too." "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Baptist Eastern region?" He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region." I said, "Me too." "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1879 or Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912? He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912. I said, "Die, heretic!" and I pushed him over the ledge. So, what do we argue about and what's really important? That's the way he says, that's why I'm not going into some of these things that denominations argue about. Because we sometimes can't agree whether or not it's a major disagreement or a minor disagreement. He points out that he gave this manuscript, he says this on page 11, he gave the manuscript of this book to 4 pastors, or 4 clergy, an Anglican priest, a Methodist pastor, a Presbyterian pastor, and a Roman Catholic priest. Because he's trying to find something that everybody could agree on. That all these 4 different denominations could all say, yes, this is mere Christianity. This is basic Christianity. He said the only criticism he got, the Methodists thought he didn't talk enough about faith, and the Roman Catholic thought he didn't go into the different theories of the atonement enough. He said, other than that, he didn't get any negative feedback. So he feels pretty good about it, about mere Christianity. And that is therefore what he's trying to do. He also points out, as part of this preface, on page XII 12, that he is careful not to talk too much about any, quote, sin that he has no experience with and no temptation about. He said, for example, gambling. He said, I've never been tempted to gamble. It has no temptation for me. So I can't relate to somebody who has this as a major temptation of their life. He says, I can't relate to that. I've never been tempted to gamble. He also talks about, which was a big issue of the 1940s, whether or not artificial birth control could be used. And he said, I'm not a woman, and I'm hesitant to talk about that. Now, here's the the part that of all the things in this preface that spoke to me just on a level that I really, really appreciated, is here's I do want to read a paragraph here. It's at the bottom of page 12 of the preface. He says, far deeper objections may be felt, objections that people might give to his writings. He's trying to up front say, here's what some people may find offensive or distasteful or they may not like about what I've written here. Far deeper objections may be felt and have been expressed against my use of the word Christian to mean one who accepts the common doctrines of Christianity. People ask, who are you to lay down who is and who is not a Christian? Or, may not many a man who cannot believe these doctrines be far more truly a Christian, far closer to the Spirit of Christ than some who do? And I heard people say that. Now, this objection is in one sense very right, very charitable, very spiritual, very sensitive. It has every available quality except that of being useful. Which is his very British way of saying the argument is totally wrong. It's totally useless. We simply cannot, without disaster, use language as the objectors want us to use it. I'll make this clear by the history of another and very much less important word. Why? What is wrong with the word Christian? He says, let's talk about the word gentleman. He says, originally, the word gentleman was a very specific word. It meant a man who had a coat of arms who owned land. A gentleman was a man who had a coat of arms and owned land. That was a gentleman. It says, when you called a man a gentleman, you weren't complimenting him. You were just stating a fact. He's a landowner. When you said someone was not a gentleman, you weren't insulting him. You were simply stating he doesn't own land. So the word gentleman had a very specific meaning, a man who owns land. He says you're merely stating a fact. This person owns land or this person does not own land. Therefore, this one is a gentleman, this one is not a gentleman. He says, in the middle, the first full paragraph on 13, if you said he was not a gentleman, you were not insulting him, but giving information. There was no contradiction in saying that John was a liar and a gentleman, any more than there was saying that James is a fool and a M.A. But then there came people who said, so rightly, charitably, spiritually, sensitively, so anything but usefully, and again, they said things that were anything but useful. But surely the important thing about a gentleman is not the coat of arms and the land, but the behavior. Surely he is the true gentleman who behaves as a gentleman should. Surely in that sense, Edward is far more truly a gentleman than John. They mean well. To be honorable and courteous and brave is, of course, a far better thing than having a coat of arms. But it's not the same thing. Worse still, it's not a thing everyone will agree about. To call a man a gentleman in this new refined sense becomes, in fact, not a way of giving information about him, but a way of praising him. To deny that he's a gentleman simply becomes a way of insulting him. When a word ceases to be a term of description and becomes merely a term of praise, it no longer tells you facts about the object. It only tells you about the speaker's attitude to that object. He goes on to say, as a result, gentleman is now a useless word. And it is. Matter of fact, I've been in a few times, I don't try to go to disreputable places, but I've been to some pretty shabby places with some pretty pretty awful decor and some, things. And there on the restroom door it says, gentlemen. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean for you to walk into that room? What are the prerequisites to walking into the room that says gentlemen on the door? That you are a male. That's the only prerequisite for walking into that room, that you were a male. So the word gentleman doesn't mean anything anymore. He points that out by saying the same thing has happened or can happen to the word Christian. The same thing can happen to the word Christian. He says, in other words, if you say, well, this fellow over here who is kind and gentle and volunteers at the soup kitchen is surely more of a Christian than the person who worships Jesus. He's saying, well, once you say that, the word Christian doesn't mean anything. He says, therefore, he says, there towards the bottom of page 14, Roman numeral. It says, it will become, okay, in calling anyone, it's about 4 lines from the bottom. In calling anyone a Christian, they will mean that they think him a good man. But that way of using the word will be no enrichment of the language, for we already have the word good. Meanwhile, the word Christian will have been spoiled for any really useful purpose that it might have served. We must therefore stick to the original obvious meaning. The name Christians was first given as Antioch in Acts 11 to the disciples, to those who accepted the teaching of the apostles. There's no question of its being restricted to those who profited by that teaching as much as they should have. There's no question of it being extended to those who in some refined spiritual inward fashion were far closer to the Spirit of Christ than the less satisfactory of the disciples. The point is not a theological or moral one. It is only a question of using words so that we can all understand what's being said. When a man who accepts the Christian doctrine lives unworthily of it, it is much clearer to say he is a bad Christian than to say he's not a Christian. In other words, he is saying a Christian is someone who believes in the essential doctrines of Christianity, who believes that Jesus Christ is Lord, who believes that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, who believes that Jesus Christ was born, lived, died, was resurrected on the third day, that he is indeed the Son of the living God. I mean, a Christian is someone who adheres to the teachings of Christ and who believes in Jesus as Lord and Savior. And he's saying well, if the word Christian just means a good person, then the word Christian has become useless. And so he's saying, when I use the word Christian, I'm meaning not just a good person, but somebody who has accepted Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Now, their behavior may not reflect that always. They may be a very poor disciple. They may be very poor at doing that. He's just saying you've got to use the word Christian not as a general term to mean good people. I experienced this years ago. Out of all things, a comic book convention, when I had read that a certain author who was going to be writing the Marvel character Daredevil was going to, quote, make him more Christian in his character. And this excited me. And I went to the convention to that writer, and I said, I hear you, blah, blah, blah. And I said, so is Daredevil going to be like going to church and reading the Bible or talking about Jesus? And she looked at me like I had 2 heads. She was like, well, no. I mean, he's going to be like, just and righteous and good, For her, exactly. She didn't mean anything about belief. She just meant he's going to be kind, and generous and righteous, For her, the idea that he would actually ever mention the name Jesus was reprehensible. So that's what he's just saying here. And so he goes on to say, if you think of Christianity instead of a tree, he says, think of it as a whole bunch of rooms. Each room is a different denomination, and there's a big hall in the middle, and you got to pick which room you're going to occupy. And he said at the end there, if you think about denominations that way, the very last paragraph of his preface, when you've reached your own room, be kind to those who've chosen different doors and to those who are still in the hall. If they're wrong, they need your prayers all the more. If they're your enemies, then you are under orders to pray for them. It's one of the rules common to the whole house. The whole house being all of Christianity, all of Christendom. We are at a place. Remember, Lewis wrote these words in the 1940s. This is now about 80 years ago that he wrote these words. The world has changed quite a bit in 80 years. And the number of people who, when they do a survey, a census, and they ask, and I don't know if when they take a census every 10 years in this country, do they even ask the religious question anymore? I don't know that they do. Other polls they ask people, what is your religion, For a long time, up until maybe the last 15, 20 years, a very large majority of Americans said, well, I'm a Christian. The number of Americans who now say they're a Christian is less than 50%. Because it used to be people would say they were a Christian. Well, do you go to church? Well, no. Do you read your Bible? No. Do you ever really engage in any Christian Bible study or activity? No. Would you call Jesus would you call Christianity as an important part of your life, an important part of what you do every day? No. But I'm a Christian. For a long time in this culture, Christian became a default. Well, I believe there is a God. I'm not Jewish. I'm not a Buddhist. I'm not a Muslim. I'm not whatever. So by default, I'm a Christian. I mentioned this, I think, in a sermon long ago, and I always hesitate to mention it because it makes it sound like I'm really critiquing my dad, which I kind of am. But when I get to be in high school and I was really becoming much more serious about following Jesus, because of youth group, because of things in the church, that I was becoming a much more committed Christian. I was doing a lot of Christian stuff at the church several times a week. And I became curious about my parents' faith. I was at church a whole lot more than they were. And my dad was a man of very few words his whole life. My dad would go days without speaking a word to me or my mother. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. But anyway, I said, I need to know this. So I waited until I had my dad alone. And I said, Dad, I need to know something about your faith. I need something about your, how you relate to God and Jesus. I need to hear something about your faith. And my dad kind of paused, and I could see he was trying to formulate an answer, and this was his answer. My dad was an usher. That's all he said. My dad was an usher. Which was hugely disappointing to me. That was the best he could come up with when I asked him to talk about his faith. Not even he was an usher, but that his dad was an usher. So anyway, the foreword, of course, is not written by Lewis. The foreword is just a couple of pages to get us into it. It's reminding us of some of the things that I already told you about what brought this book about. In the middle of the bombing of London, the Blitz, Lewis was asked to make these speeches on the BBC, delivered between 1942 and 1944. He did this because they thought the people of Great Britain didn't really understand Christianity. And if that was true in 1942, how true is it in 2026? Especially when, and I'm not British. My 2 weeks in England doesn't make me an expert on Great Britain. But I did see an interview with King Charles once he became king. And the various titles of the king or queen, the monarch of England. Because, the king, legally, technically, the king or the queen of England is the head of the Church of England. When Henry VIII broke from Roman Catholicism in the 1500s, and they formed the Church of England, the king, then Henry VIII, became the head of the Church of England. And to this day, the monarch, the king or queen of England, is the head of the Church of England. So therefore, one of the titles for Queen Elizabeth and now for King Charles III, one of the titles of the monarch of England is Defender of the Faith. Defender of the Faith. And so when Charles became King Charles III, he's being interviewed about now you're finally, after all this time, you're an old man, but now you're finally king. They didn't say that, but I mean, he's finally king, right? And they're asking him about some of these titles, and they said, and you're the head of the church. You're the defender of the faith. And King Charles said, well, I see myself as the defender of all faiths. Which is a very politically correct statement, but it's an absolute abdication of his job. It's an absolute abdication of the job of head of the Church of England, of defender of the faith. If he's the defender of all faith, he no longer sees Christianity as something to be defended. So, this talks about how this story came about, and it talks about how Lewis, in his writings, because he's a professor primarily of medieval literature, specializing in various mythologies of Norse culture and the different cultures and their myths and their legends and all of that. You can see why he and Tolkien and these guys are all kind of in the same interest of what we would maybe call not only old myths and legends and pantheons and all that, but you can see that in The Lord of the Rings, in The Hobbit, in Narnia, and all these books. But how human imagination helps us to really grasp deeper truths. And how you see that you see that in the Narnia books for Lewis and in the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings books with Tolkien. But especially in Lewis, you see how he uses even fiction and fantasy to reinforce Christian worldview, Christian thinking. And one of the things, look on page now 19, XIX, of the forward. It says, the mere Christianity of C.S. Lewis is not a philosophy or even a theology that may be considered, argued, and put away in a book on a shelf. It's a way of life, one that challenges us always to remember, as Lewis once stated, that there are no ordinary people, and that, quoting Lewis here, it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. In other words, if we truly are made in the image of God, if we have an eternal soul, then every person that we interact with is an immortal. All the people that we interact with are immortals, which is not the way we typically think about the people in our lives. So, having said that, we can get to the actual book now. I realize I've taken out, but in case you're wondering, the way we're doing Faithbreak, the calendar is, Easter's really early this year, and we looked at March, and we realized that we'd only be able to meet once in March because of all the various interruptions of spring break and Ash Wednesday and all kinds of other things. So we're going to have 5 solid weeks of this class. I doubt I'll get through the entire book in 5 weeks, and then we're going to basically break for the whole month of March, and then we'll do 5 more solid weeks instead of going off this week, not this week, back and forth, back. I think that's real disruptive. So we do 5 weeks in a row, and we'll take a significant several-week break, then we'll do 5 more weeks, and we'll probably still be not done, I would guess. So, as I said, the first section, book 1, is in some ways a little frustrating because we're kind of waiting to get to God. And it's not where he starts. He starts, and you realize, if you've read it, and even if you haven't, he starts by trying to make a case that there is something outside of what we perceive. That there is something beyond the material world. He goes on to say there are really 2 ways of viewing reality. And this is why, some of this is why I went ahead and pursued philosophy before I pursued theology. Because you start, in philosophy, believe me, as somebody who has a degree in it, philosophy can become real chasing your own tail. It can become real, why are you arguing about something so ridiculous? Philosophy can become something pretty silly sometimes. When I was a grad student in philosophy at OU and working under one of the only professors who professed Christianity. Every other professor in the department was an atheist. But there was one professor who professed to be a Christian, a very unorthodox Christian. It's a very progressive Christian, but at least he was a professing Christian. And I worked under him as his teaching assistant. And one day after a class in philosophy, I said, we'd been off on some tangent of something that seemed not to matter at all. And I said, it feels like sometimes we're just chasing our own tails on some of this philosophy. And he's like, oh, you figured that out, did you? He was kind of going, yep, that's often what philosophy can be. Philosophy, like anything, is more about teaching you how to think, how to really think with logic, with reason, with understanding logical arguments, understanding how if A plus B equals C. Just as a matter of fact, I took a course, there was half of us who were grad students in theology or in philosophy, half of the other students were grad students in mathematics. Because in the Venn diagram, there's a place where math and philosophy meet because it's all about logic. A is greater than B, B is greater than C, therefore A is greater than C. That's math, but it's also logic, and it's also philosophy. So anyway, he begins by trying to say, how do we know there's something outside the material world? Because either you believe that the universe just happened, or you believe there's a creator. I'm going to talk to this about the students in apologetics, because really, there's only two ways of thinking about reality. Why is there anything? Why is there a universe? Why does anything exist? Why are there galaxies? Why are there, billions of galaxies? Why is there anything? Why does anything exist? Well, either it just happened or somebody made it happen. Either reality just is with no cause, no anything other than it just is, or there is someone or something that brought it into being. And those are really the 2 ways of looking at everything. And so, he's starting out by saying, what is a good reason to believe that there is something outside of the material world? in other words, which eventually we're going to call God. Why is there good reason to believe there's something outside of the universe that is separate from the universe that eventually we're going to come to call the Creator God? So the place he starts is not with, well, the beauty of creation, or the human eye is so complex it couldn't have just evolved this way, or all kinds of arguments are made to try to say why there is a creator rather than things just came out of nothing for no particular reason. He starts with what he calls human nature. But what he means by human nature is the belief that there is such a thing as right and wrong. He's going to take several pages to argue about right and wrong. And that's what this first book is about. And he starts by, as he often tries, some examples. And that first paragraph, I want to read it because it sets the stage for the whole chapter. He says, everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny. Sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant. But however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kind of things they say. They say things like this. Well, how'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was here first. Leave him alone. He isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised. People say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated. Children as well as adults. He says, now what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. And the other man very seldom replies, to hell with your standard. Nearly always he tries to make out that what he's been doing really does not really go against the standard, or that if it does, there's some special excuse. He pretends there's some special reason in this particular case why the person who took the seat first should not keep it, or that things were quite different when he was given a bit of orange, or that something is turned up which lets him off the keeping his promise. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play, or decent behavior, or morality, or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed. He's saying, when people, even children, even very young children, will say things like, that's not fair. That's not fair. And people don't go, well, there's no such thing as fair. There's no such thing as right and wrong. He is going to argue that deep inside of every human, there is this sense of fairness, this sense of right and wrong. He calls it the law of nature. Now, I think that's a little confusing, at least 80 years later, because law of nature to us, I think, suggests something different. He says there, this law or rule about right and wrong used to be called the law of nature. And he says what they really mean is the law of human nature. And so when he talks about law of nature, he's talking about this sense that humans have an intrinsic, guttural belief that there is such a thing as right and wrong, fair and unfair. And that there's other laws like gravity that every object has, a rock has to obey. He says you can't disobey the law of gravity. And he says on page 5, it says in the first full paragraph, this law was called the law of nature because people thought that everyone knew it by nature and did not need to be taught it. That people believe it is obvious. He says, middle of that paragraph, taking the race, the human race as a whole, they thought that the human idea of decent behavior was obvious to everyone. And I believe they're right. If they're not, then all the things we said about war, and they're in the middle of World War II, are nonsense. What was the sense in saying the enemy was in the wrong unless right is a real thing, which the Nazis at bottom knew as well as we did and ought to have practiced? He's saying the Nazis know they're doing something wrong. Or they are justifying and saying that what they're doing is right. But even the Nazis have a sense of right and wrong. The Nazis are not saying, well, there's no such thing as right and wrong. No, the Nazis also believe in a sense of right and wrong, which they are violating. And some of them know at their core that they are violating right and wrong. But he says no one is arguing there's no such thing. He says if they had no notion of what we mean by right, then though we might still have had to fight them, we couldn't have blamed them for it any more than we could blame someone for the color of his hair. He says there is inside of us this sense of right and wrong. And he's going to go on to say, well, people are going to say, it's a learned thing. It's a learned behavior. And every culture has differences about right and wrong. And he's like, no, not really. He says there at the bottom of 5, I know that some people say that the idea of a law of nature, a decent behavior known to all men, is unsound, because different civilizations and different ages have had quite different moralities. But then he says that's just really not true. And of course, he's somebody who studied all kinds of cultures. He says if you study Egyptians, Babylonians, Hindus, Chinese, Greeks, Romans, you'll find that, none of them say that double-crossing somebody is good, that kindness is bad. I mean, he says you can't find a country where they have a morality that says, hurting innocents is a good thing. Or, he says there's this universal sense of right and wrong. He says if you're trying to imagine a country where that sense of right and wrong doesn't exist, he says you might as well imagine a country where 2 and 2 is 5. It just isn't there. He says selfishness has never been admired. These are universal things. And he says there at the bottom of 6, this is remarkable. When you find a man who says he doesn't believe in a real right and wrong, and there are people who say that, you'll find the same man going back a moment later. He may break his promise to you. If you try breaking one to him, he will be complaining, it's not fair, before you can say Jack Robinson. A person who says there's no such thing as right and wrong, if you cheat him, if you hurt him, he'll complain about it. And you say, I thought you said there was no such thing as right and wrong. Well, of course, he really does believe in right and wrong. Here is, you may have heard me say, when I was much younger and a grad student in philosophy and maybe more argumentative than I am now, but it was easy to be in a room full of 10 or 12 graduate students in philosophy and a professor, and I'm the only one who's a Christian. And people are like, oh, that sounds bad. Oh, no, it was great. For somebody who likes to argue, because when you're arguing with a room full of atheists, and they're saying, well, your idea of God, okay, tell me where the universe came from. Well, we don't know. Well, wait a minute. So you're criticizing my understanding, but you have no idea of where anything came from. You have no response of your own. You can criticize what I think, but and I had a couple of pretty radical atheists. I remember one conversation. It's been 40 plus years ago, but I still remember it because we were arguing: is there such a thing as right and wrong? And I was arguing that our sense of right and wrong comes from God. And this woman who was an atheist, she was arguing that there is no such thing as right and wrong. She was saying there is no such thing as right and wrong. She was saying there's only majority opinion. And, a society decides that something is right, and then 100 years later they decide it's wrong. She says, there is no absolutes. There are no absolutes. There are no such thing as right and wrong. And I said, without God, she's right. And that's what Lewis is arguing here. He is arguing that it is because we are a created being, created with this intrinsic understanding of right and wrong, good and evil, that is from the outside, that is proof that there is a God. That's how he gets to, this is why we know there's a God. Because you cannot explain this inborn sense of right and wrong any other way. You can't explain it by evolution. You can't explain it by group dynamics. You can't say it's for the survival of the species. Because a lot of people would go, well, the heck with the species. I don't care about the species. He says at the bottom now, page 6, a nation may say treaties don't matter, but then the next minute they spoil their case by saying that the particular treaty that they want to break was an unfair one. If treaties don't matter, if there is no such thing as right and wrong, in other words, if there is no law of nature, what's the difference between a fair treaty and an unfair one? Have they not let the cat out of the bag and shown that whatever they say, they really know the law of nature just like everyone else? So he's saying, even people who deny that there's such a thing as right and wrong really don't believe it. So he says, the universe, you can call it, he's not ready to call it God yet. He's just saying there is an outside force that is implanted in human beings a sense of right and wrong. And then he goes on to say, there at the first full paragraph of 7, it seems then we're forced to believe in a real right and wrong, that it really does exist. People may sometimes be mistaken about them, just as sometimes people get their sums wrong, in other words, their math wrong, but they're not a matter of mere taste and opinion. Right and wrong is not a matter of taste and opinion, he says, any more than the multiplication tables. Now, if we're agreed about this, he says, I may go on to my next point, which is his second point in this whole section, which is this: none of us are good at keeping it. None of us are really keeping this law of right and wrong. In other words, in biblical terms, he's going to come to the place of arguing everybody is a sinner. Everybody falls short. In other words, there is no person who perfectly keeps this sense of always doing the right thing. None of us are really keeping the law of nature. If there are any exceptions among you, I apologize to them. They had much better read some other. They had better read some other book. Nothing I'm going to say concerns them. In other words, if you have never done anything wrong in your life, if you're perfect, then you might as well stop reading, because this book isn't for you if you're perfect. And now, turning to the ordinary human beings who are left, he says, I hope you're not misunderstanding what I'm saying. I'm not preaching. Heaven knows I don't pretend to be better than anyone else. I'm only trying to call attention to a fact. The fact that this year, or this month, or more likely this very day, you have failed to practice, we have failed to practice ourselves the kind of behavior we expect from other people. And that is human nature as well. Because when somebody is rude and cuts us off in traffic, they're a jerk and a horrible person. When we do it, it was an accident. I didn't mean to do it. We are quick to condemn the other person and even quicker to excuse ourselves. And that is human nature, to condemn others and excuse ourselves. He says, there may be all sorts of excuses for us. That time you were so unfair to the children was when you were very tired. That slightly shady business about the money, the one you've almost forgotten, came when you were so very hard up. And what you promised to do for old so-and-so and have never done, well, you never would have promised if you'd known how frightfully busy you were going to be. And as for your behavior to your wife or husband or sister or brother, if I knew how irritating they could be, I would not wonder at it. And who the dickens am I anyway? I'm just the same. That is to say, I don't succeed in keeping the law of nature, which is the law of human nature, very well. And the moment anyone tells me I'm not keeping it, they start up in my mind a string of excuses as long as your arm, which is what humans do. So the question at the moment is not whether they are good excuses. The point is they are one more proof of how deeply, whether we like it or not, we believe in this law of nature. If we don't believe in decent behavior, why should we be so anxious to make excuses for not having behaved decently? I'm going to go on. He basically says there is such a thing, and we constantly break it and make excuses for it. So his conclusion of this first section is that last paragraph. Here's the 2 points, he says. First, human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and cannot really get rid of it. Second, that they do not in fact behave that way. They know the law of nature and they break it. And these 2 facts, which he says, these aren't just theories or opinions, these are 2 facts, are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. So that's his starting point. We live in a universe where right and wrong objectively exist. And we live in a universe where we do not live up to that. So, I've got a couple more. So then he goes on to say some objections. In other words, okay, some of you may not believe or buy what I've just said. He says, now here's what some people are going to say about that. They're going to say, well, no, Lewis. You can explain all this by survival of the fittest and herd instinct and evolution and groupthink. And I mean, he says, there's people who are going to say, no, it doesn't have to come from some outside source. You can explain this through anthropology and things like that. That paragraph, that second paragraph on page 9, he says, here's an objection. Isn't what you call the moral law simply our herd instinct and hasn't been developed just like all of our other instincts? And he says, no, I don't deny that we have a herd instinct, but that's not what I mean. We all know what it feels like to be prompted by instinct. He says by mother love or sexual instinct or the instinct for food. It means you feel a strong want or desire to act a certain way. And of course, we sometimes do feel just that sort of desire to help another person, and no doubt that desire is due to a herd instinct. But feeling a desire to help is quite different from feeling that you ought to help, whether you want to or not. It says, supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger. You feel 2 desires. One is a desire to help, due to your herd instinct. The other, a desire to keep out of danger, which is an instinct for self-preservation. So you hear a cry for help. You've got 2 instincts. Help. Oh, I got to stay out of danger myself. He says, you'll find inside of you, in addition to these 2 impulses, a third thing, which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run. That thing that judges between the 2 instincts can't be either of them. He says that is the proof of this underlying need to understand right and wrong. And he goes into some pretty, again, I would say here he gets really deep, and maybe it's a little challenging. I'm not going to go into that next couple of paragraphs, except he's trying, again, to say this is not explainable. This right and wrong thing is not explainable by some anthropological explanation. Look on page 12. Top of page 12, the paragraph that starts there. It says, another person wrote to me and said this, isn't what you call the moral law just a social convention, something that's put into us by education? In other words, aren't we just kind of taught this morality? And here he says, I think there's a misunderstanding here. The people that ask that question are usually taking it for granted that if we've learned a thing from parents and teachers, then that thing must be merely a human invention. But of course, that's not so. We all learned the multiplication tables at school. A child who grew up alone on a desert island wouldn't know it. But surely it doesn't follow that the multiplication table is a human convention, something human beings have made up for themselves and might have made up differently. I fully agree that we learn the rule of decent behavior from parents and teachers and friends and books, as we learn everything. But some of the things we learn are mere conventions, which might have been different. We learn to keep to the left of the road. In England you do, not here. But it might just as well have been the rule to keep to the right. And others of them, like mathematics, are real truths. The question is, which class the law of human nature belongs? He's saying this right and wrong is not like the decision in a culture to drive on the right side of the road as opposed to the left side of the road. He is saying the law of human nature is like math. That 2 and 2 is always going to equal 4 for all time, in all cultures, everywhere. Human beings did not create the truths of mathematics. 2 and 2 was always 4 before there were human beings. I mean, he's like, math is not something that is just like, I think we're going to paint it blue today. I mean, he's saying this feeling of right and wrong is not just a human convention. It's not just something that we decided, well, beating up an innocent person is wrong. And like, okay, let's all agree to that. Like it's some arbitrary rule. No, he's saying it's buried deep within us that cheating somebody is wrong, that lying to somebody is wrong, that these things are intrinsically wrong, every culture, every time period. And and then he says, next page, he says, we're talking about progress and changing cultures, but where the word progress begins about 8 lines down on page 13. Progress means not just changing, but changing for the better. If no set of moral ideas were truer or better than any other, there'd be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality, or Christian morality to Nazi morality. And of course, Nazi morality is a very present thing as he's writing this. In fact, of course, we all do believe that some moralities are better than others. Some of the people who tried to change the moral ideas of their own age were what we would call reformers or pioneers, people who understand morality better than their neighbors. Very well. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. But the standard that measures the two things is different from either of them. In other words, you're comparing them to this eternal thing. He's maybe overemphasizing. He keeps hammering the point that these things are inborn to us, that they are not. So just to quickly get kind of to the end of this one little section, because we're only on page 13. He says, he says there has to be a real morality, not just something that is a fashion or a preference. And that he brings up, well, but 300 years ago, middle of page 14, he says, 300 years ago, people in England were putting witches to death. Was that what you call the rule of human nature or right conduct? He then says, but surely the reason we don't execute witches is that we don't believe there are any such things. If we did, if we really thought there were people going about who had sold themselves to the devil and received supernatural powers from him in return and were using these powers to kill their neighbors or drive them mad or bring bad weather, surely we'd all agree that if anyone deserved the death penalty, then these filthy quislings did. There's no difference of moral principle here. The difference is simply about a matter of fact. It may be a great advance in knowledge not to believe in witches, but there's no moral advance in not executing them when you don't think they are there. You would not call a man humane for ceasing to set mousetraps if he did so because he believed there were no mice. So he imagines the objections to his feeling, and where he's, of course, going to get to, and not to, spoiler alert, what he's going to get to before the end of this first section, again, is that there's something outside of what he would call the material world. There's something outside of matter. There's something that, eventually you would call super nature, supernatural. And that thing, he says, and again, we'll talk about this next week. He says, now, I'm not going to jump from that to saying the God of Israel and Father of Jesus. You can't just jump that quick to that. You first have to agree that there is what he would call a mind, a power, something outside of what we call the universe. That there is something that has not only created the universe, but that is the source of this implanted understanding of right and wrong. This understanding of morality that is not a human invention. He is arguing that morality is not something that humans just cooked up, but that it is something put into us by the one who created us in his image. Now, he's not gotten there yet, and that's why we feel like we're going slow here, because we haven't got to, we haven't gotten to Jesus or the Bible or even calling God God or any of those things. But he's building this foundation, and at the end, we haven't kind of got to the end of this first section, but we're going to get to a place where he's going to be able to say, once we believe there is something outside of us that is the source of morality, and once we realize that we don't live up to it, we're going to realize that there's a source of goodness, and we're in a pickle because we don't live up to it, and we need some way to be rescued from this predicament of our own lack of morality, our own lack of doing the right thing, that all of us fall short, all of us mess up. Now, you don't have to wait to read as much of this book as you want and then reread it and then read it again. Because I've discovered, even though this was meant to be for lay people, you know what I mean? This was a radio address to just the regular folks of England. This wasn't written for scholars. It wasn't written for philosophy students or theology students or anything else. It was written for the common person. And I think his writing is because he continually uses, I think, really good illustrations. It still is not what you'd call an easy read. It's not like reading, the latest thing on Facebook. I mean, it's not, it's deep. It's not, I don't think it's, so dense as to be hard to comprehend what he's trying to get at. But sometimes, he's writing the way people wrote 80 years ago. He's British, and we are not used to reading something quite like this. We're not used to reading this. But I think that's why I'd say if it's not a horribly thick book. I'd say read it, and then maybe a couple of days later read it again and see if some of it makes a little more sense. So we're going to wrap up. Anything that from the part we just covered that is kind of unclear, or you're not sure you get what he's trying to get at, or it doesn't make a lot of sense, or anything like that? Are you enjoying reading it? Is it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is challenging. Yeah, especially I think. Yeah. Well, of the four sections, or the 5 sections, is it 4 or 5? Anyway, of the sections, the 4 quote books, this book 1 about right and wrong, I think is the most challenging. Okay, I think when we get to the next book 2, you'll find you're a little more familiar ground, because he'll start talking more about concepts that we talk about more every day, about God concepts and Christ and church and things like that. But we just haven't gotten there yet, because he's approaching the person who was like him, who was the atheist. And the thing that, of course, we all know, and it's become more and more true, maybe there was a time in our culture or in British culture where if you're debating with somebody and you said, well, but the Bible says X, Y, Z, and they would somehow go, oh, well, but a lot of people now, if you say, well, the Bible says X, Y, Z, they'll go, well, so what? They don't see the Bible having any authority in their lives. They don't see the Bible as having any. I mean, if you quote the Bible to some people, it's like, somebody quoting the Quran to you. You would just go, well, I mean, you don't give it any authority. You have to sometimes find a different route. If somebody is totally separate from Christianity, if somebody is an atheist, if somebody has rejected Christianity, quoting the Bible to them is often not going to work. And the example, of course, is Paul when he went to Athens. When Paul went to Athens, and he is talking to the philosophers, the Greek philosophers on the Areopagus, on Mars Hill, where the philosophers would go and do what I did when I was a philosophy student, just talk in circles all day. When Paul goes to the Areopagus, to Mars Hill in Athens, and debates with the schools of philosophy, he doesn't quote the Old Testament to them. He quotes a Greek poet. If you read that in the book of Acts, Paul quotes a Greek poet to the Greek philosophers, because he knows if he quoted the Old Testament to a bunch of Greek philosophers, they'd go, so what? It would have no resonance or authority over them. He knows he has to take a different route. And of course, I would say the most effective way to talk to somebody about Christianity is not to try to argue them into the kingdom. It's to say, here's what Jesus has done in my life. Because they can't say, no, he didn't. I mean, you are the expert on God in your life. You are the expert on Jesus in your life. And so for you, if you say to somebody, well, this is how God has changed my life. This is how God has impacted my life. This is how Christ has formed my life. They can't say, no, he didn't. I mean, I think a personal, now that is not, for some people that's not sufficient. I mean, that's like the only thing, because they can say, well, that's nice for you. But I mean, that's a statement that they can't dispute. But for some people, the first hurdle is there a God? Is there a God? I think there are multiple reasons why it makes more sense to believe that somebody created this universe than that it just happened. I think the first step is yes. Even atheists use an interesting word to talk about the universe. They talk about creation, don't they? They say something about in all of creation. Sometimes they don't realize they're using the word creation, because once you use the word creation, that implies what? Creator. Once you use the word creation, you're implying that there is a creator.